questions. Thanks. So,
Thank you, Linda, and thanks to NCRW and the U.S. Committee for UNIFEM and all of my panelists who essentially have said everything that I needed to say, and I've always wanted to do this. I mean, my speech, I don't really need to make it anymore. You've all talked about it, so I think I can just, no. But since I'm here, it is the 10-year anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1325, which was really a historic landmark for women. And so I keep thinking as I'm listening this morning to stories of injustice and violence and inequality that someone said, you know, the true test of brilliance is being able to hold two opposing ideas in your mind at the same time. And so on the one hand, I'm thinking it's true. Horrible injustice and inequality. On the other hand, huge conceptual shifts and advances in the way we understand women's rights and gender equality from the perspective, and this is just a small window, of, for instance, how we understand sexual violence in war. And if you think about Security Council Resolution 1325, which was passed in 2000 on women, peace, and security, which basically said that women and men experience violence, war differently, and that women and girls need different protection and special protection, and that women have a right, and this is very important, have a right to be at the tables where decisions are being made about how to deal with war. And after 7, 8 years of 1325 with really absolutely abysmal implementation. I mean, I don't think there's any Security Council resolution in the world that has the constituency that 1325 has on the ground, women. But as far as the implementation by governments, by Security Council members, I think year after year we gathered to commemorate in the Security Council, and we saw the numbers, and people talked about tracking. The numbers got worse and worse. UNIFEM did, for instance, a review of 24 peace agreements that have been signed over the past 15 years. 2% of signatories are women. 7% of negotiators have been women. There has never been a chief negotiator who is a woman assigned by the United Nations. Actually, the numbers in the UN in terms of participants in peace negotiations have gotten worse since 2000, not better. So the calls to account, I think, are absolutely crucial, and that is one of the mantras we're using for 2010 is we have to be counting. And you know, listening also, so 1325, in part because its implementation was so inadequate, there was a move, and very much helped, I think, in an insidious way, by the horrible rapes in DRC, by filmmakers like Abby Disney and others who were documenting those rapes, and Security Council members actually seeing them, then agreeing to pass Security Council Resolution 1820, which focuses specifically on sexual violence, then Security Council Resolution 1888 and 1889, one of which focuses even more on strengthening the mechanisms of accountability for implementing 1820 on violence, and the other one that specifies, again, more accountability, particularly on the issue of women's participation in peace processes, which, as I say, have been abysmal. Let me just say 2 more things. One, I think this morning what I was hearing, and because I'm from the UN, I'm very sensitive to the potential for acronyms, is justice, the need for justice, the need for accountability, and the need for money. Right? So that would be jam. We have to jam. And we have to jam loudly for the things that we need. The issue of impunity is absolutely crucial. Right now, the incentive for perpetrators is very high because the more they perpetrate, the more likely that they will be rewarded with a place at the peace table. The people who are advocating and working for peace, and UNIFEM has supported scores of women's coalitions in Burundi, in DRC, in Afghanistan, in Timor, to make their way to peace negotiations and sit outside as observers, waiting, lobbying from the outside, because they can't get to the peace table. They can't get to the donor conferences. They can't get inside the room, because who gets into the room are the perpetrators. That are who the legitimate interlocutors are. So we have to make sure that we can change those incentives. But I also just wanted to say that in the area of impunity, you know, it's not just in war and conflict that it happens. There's Joanna Burke, writing from the UK, reported that in the UK, only 5% of rapes reported to the police end in conviction in 2007. And that number declined from 33% in 1977. So in 30 years, there's actually been a decline in the number of convictions. Impunity is an absolutely huge issue that we have to deal with. Accountability, because as Nancy was speaking about earlier, about what was happening in the refugee camps, you know, the UN has been producing guidelines for more than a decade about how to run refugee camps that pay attention to women's rights and gender issues. And no matter how many guidelines there are, no matter how many trainings we have, this continues to happen, that men receive the food tickets and women have to engage in transactional sex. So there's something also that we have to be asking ourselves about what it is we're asking for, what it is we're demanding that actually interrupts a cycle where we've secured really groundbreaking visionary commitments to protect and promote women's rights, and yet on the ground where women live, where women are being violated, this is perpetuated. So when we come back to solutions, I have some.
Joanne, thank you. Actually, we're going to go to you first with the solutions, because I think it's really important to understand what some of the institutional efforts are, and then how can we, in our advocacy work, be supportive of those efforts and work with you. So why don't you go on and give us a little bit of that lens?
Okay, I would say four, and many of them have been touched on. The first is that, and now I'm talking specifically about sexual violence and war. You know, again, the first couple, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
You have to speak into it.
Okay.
Close, the mics are not strong.
Okay.
Hold it close.
After many years of lobbying and advocating for implementation of 1325, we finally understood that one of the things we needed to do was talk to the militaries. We needed to talk to the blue helmets and the largely men who were out in the world and who could actually be affording greater protection to women in very commonsensical ways. And so we did an inventory. We met with militaries and did an inventory of what their ideas were for enhancing protection, and found, not surprisingly, that actually many of them had very good ideas and were in an ad hoc fashion doing what they could do. And when we asked them, so why isn't this happening systematically, they said, because we've never been ordered to do it, right? So the mandates from the Security Council were not specifying protection of women from rape and sexual violence as a mandate of the peacekeepers. Now, I think that is now being changed. Now that is in their mandate. So you have to think about the fact that that could save the lives of millions and millions of people, right? Just simple thing of putting it in the mandate. Of course, they need budgets, they need training, and many other things. And that's a kind of foreign public policy issue that the US government as well has been supportive of and needs to push. So we're talking about that with militaries that are deployed by the UN Security Council, but militaries are deployed by many countries, by many different places, and do they have that in their mandates? That's number one. Number two, many of the panelists before talked about indicators, talked about accountability. Over the past year, in the context of the 10-year anniversary, UNIFEM and the internal network on women, peace, and security in the UN has been field testing a global set of indicators on 1325. So I think we started with 2,200 indicators, and it's now been narrowed down to about 50 indicators that could be tracked to monitor implementation of Security Council resolutions related to women's rights. This is extremely important because there has been no accountability whatsoever. And by developing those indicators, which apply both to countries in which there are conflict as well as members of Security Council and the UN itself, we believe that tracking those on a systematic basis will help us to understand also where we need to have a bigger push. Is it that we need more women in the military? Is it that we need better guidelines? Is it that we need more money, et cetera? So we would invite you to look at those indicators and then also to press the US government to hold themselves accountable to those indicators once they're finalized. The US government has been more or less supportive of the indicators. They were presented to the Security Council in draft, but I have to say, the one place where the US government was a little uncomfortable was in the area of indicators related to small arms. right? So making sure that we press forward so that there are robust indicators related to small arms is important. The third thing is special temporary measures, what we call special temporary measures. Right now, as I said, the numbers of women, and particularly women's rights advocates from civil society who are part of negotiating teams, who are in the places where policies and budgets get decided, are minuscule. And CEDAW, which is a UN convention, encourages special temporary measures. We think that this year, the 10-year anniversary of 1325, there should be an agreement to a minimum of 30% of women on negotiating teams minimally, and in other places where these ideas or these programs are being negotiated. So we'd like to see a push with that going forward. So as you are thinking about campaigning, et cetera, a 30% minimum is not very much to ask for. The fourth area is money, budgets. Now, UNIFEM and many other UN organizations support gender-responsive budgeting initiatives all over the world. There are at least 90 countries right now that have some experience with gender-responsive budgeting, which is analyzing budgets from the perspective of how they impact men and women differently. We think the UN should, as a policy, be engaging in gender-responsive budgeting. The UN should be accountable for where its money is going and how it's impacting men and women differently. We think the US government should. We think New York City should. But particularly in post-conflict reconstruction budgets, it is absolutely crucial for budgets to be disaggregated so that we know how much money is supporting the kinds of programs that all of the panelists today have been talking about. And it's very doable. The systems are there. There's huge amount of experience with gender budgeting, so why isn't it happening? The fifth area is probably the hardest, and it goes back to the issue of impunity, justice. And I'm not going to say that much about this right now. I mean, there are all kinds of ideas about having rapid response teams in relation to justice, but ultimately, until we can support countries like Liberia, like Sierra Leone, like Afghanistan, to prop up their justice systems more quickly, right, so that women can get justice the way women define justice, the way women want justice, then the cycle of impunity, the cycle of stigma and discrimination, which actually stigmatizes the victim more than the perpetrator, will continue.
Great. Joanne, thank you very much. So I like your 30% solution. I think that's critical. That's something we at the Council have been talking about. Also building pipelines of people who can fill the positions you're talking about in countries. And of course, it's linked to education and economic issues as well. Thank you. So let's move on to Annika and then to Radhika.